The man didn't even let her finish speaking. Gerald Hurst took one look at Clara Whitmore standing on the platform of Silver Creek Station, her dress wrinkled from 4 days of rail travel, her 6-year-old boy pressed against her side, fingers twisted in her skirt, and he held up his hand like she was a peddler at his door. "No," he said. Just that. One word, flat as a stone dropped in dry dirt. Clara blinked. "Mr. Hurst, I can see who you are." His eyes moved to Ethan, then back to her with the particular coldness of a man who has already decided and finds explanation unnecessary. "You didn't mention the boy, not once in 6 months of letters. You let me believe you were—" He stopped himself, tugged at his collar. "This won't work. I'm sorry for your trouble." He wasn't sorry. His voice carried no weight of regret, only the mild inconvenience of a man returning a shipment that didn't match the order. He turned, nodded to the 2 men standing behind him, and walked back toward the street. Clara stood on that platform with her suitcase at her feet and her son's hand in hers, and 47 people watching from the depot steps. If you have ever been turned away in public, if you have ever felt the specific shame of being unwanted in front of witnesses, then you already know what she felt in that moment. And if you haven't, watch this story to the end, because what happens next will stay with you. Before we go further, if this is your first time here, please subscribe to our channel and hit the like button. Drop your city and country in the comments below. I want to know how far this story has traveled, and don't go anywhere. What happens to Clara and her son on this platform is only the beginning. The 47 people on those depot steps did not look away. That was the thing Clara would remember longest. Not Gerald Hurst's face, not the words he chose. It was the audience. The women in their afternoon dresses, the men with their thumbs hooked in their suspenders, the children who had no idea what they were watching but understood instinctively that something had gone wrong for someone. They stood there with the patient attention of people who had come to the station for entertainment and found it. A woman near the door of the depot said something to the woman beside her. Clara couldn't hear the words, but she caught the shape of the mouth. Mail order bride. And then the small, satisfied nod that followed. Ethan looked up at her. He was 6, which meant he understood more than people gave him credit for and less than he needed to. His face was open and waiting, the way children's faces are when they need an adult to tell them whether to be frightened. "Mama," he said, "where are we going now?" She didn't have an answer. She had left Lawrence, Kansas, with $43 and a train ticket and a packet of letters from Gerald Hurst that she had read so many times the creases had begun to separate. She had sold the last of her husband Daniel's tools to make the fare. She had told herself, told Ethan, told her neighbor Mrs. Fitch, who had stood on the porch and wept, that this was the practical decision, not a romantic one. She was not a fool chasing sentiment. She had been alone for 2 years, working laundry and mending and whatever else came through the door, and she had done the arithmetic carefully. A man with a ranch and a house and an offer of stability. A son who needed a room of his own and a school that might actually have books. It had made sense on paper. Paper and Arizona territory were 2 very different things. The sun was dropping now, pulling the color from the sky and leaving a harsh orange glow across the brown rooftops of Silver Creek. The depot agent, a thin man with a waxed mustache that looked more expensive than the rest of him, appeared at the door. "Ma'am." He said it with the particular tone of a man about to deliver news he finds mildly inconvenient. "I'm going to need the platform cleared before the 6:15. "Of course," Clara said. She picked up her suitcase. She had no idea where she was walking. She started walking anyway, because the alternative was to stand there and continue being looked at, and she had reached the absolute end of her capacity for that. Ethan matched her pace to 2 steps to her 1. He'd gotten good at that over the past 2 years, good at adjusting to her speed without being told. The thought of it, the image of a 5-year-old figuring out how to not slow his mother down, moved through her chest like a blade. She found the street. Silver Creek was not large, but it had the particular density of a frontier town that had grown faster than it had planned. Buildings pushed close together, a hardware store next to a saloon next to what appeared to be a dentist's office. She identified the boarding house from the painted sign above the door and pushed through it. The woman behind the desk had a face like weather-worn timber. She looked at Clara and then at Ethan and did not smile. "Room and board's $1.50 a night," she said. "Breakfast included. Dinner's extra." Clara put her hand in her bag and counted her money with her fingers before she brought it out. She had $12 left. The train back to Kansas was $6. That left $6 to figure out the rest of her life. "I'll take one night," she said. The woman pushed a key across the desk without another word. The room was small and smelled of pine tar soap and something older underneath it. There was a bed and a chair and a window that looked out on the side wall of the hardware store. Ethan sat on the edge of the bed and watched her unpack with the quiet seriousness he'd developed in the months after Daniel died. "The man didn't want us," Ethan said. "It wasn't a question." Clara folded her extra dress over the chair back. "No, he didn't." "Because of me?" She turned and looked at him. He was small for his age, with his father's dark eyes and a gap between his front teeth that she'd always found unreasonably endearing. He was asking the question with his whole body, not just his voice, shoulders drawn in, hands folded in his lap, braced for the answer. "No," she said. She sat beside him on the bed and said it again, slower. "No, not because of you. He was a man who wanted something simple, and our life isn't simple. That's not your fault. That's just the truth of us." Ethan considered this. "What are we going to do?" "I don't know yet." He nodded, apparently satisfied with the honesty, if not the content of it, and lay back on the bed, still wearing his shoes. She watched him stare at the ceiling with the peculiar, exhausted calm of a child who has learned to trust his mother's problem-solving even when she visibly has no solution. She stayed up that night at the small desk with a piece of paper and the stub of a pencil, trying to make arithmetic that didn't exist work. $12. Maybe she could find work here. There was that schoolhouse she'd seen on the main road, or what passed for one, a squat clapboard building with a crooked sign. Maybe the town needed a teacher. Maybe she could take in laundry. Maybe. She folded the paper and didn't sleep. By 7 in the morning, she had been to the school, the general store, the laundry on 2nd Street, and the diner that posted a small "Help Wanted" card in the window. The school had a teacher, a young man from Ohio who looked alarmed at her inquiry. The general store had no positions. The laundry had a woman who looked her up and down and told her she had all the help she needed. The diner's card had been there since February, and the owner had forgotten to take it down. He was his own cook and waitress, and had been for 11 years, and intended to continue. She stood on the boardwalk outside the diner at 9:30 with Ethan eating a roll she'd bought from the general store, and she understood with cold clarity that she had perhaps one day left in Silver Creek before her money ran out. A woman passed on the opposite side of the street and slowed when she saw Clara, then deliberately picked up her pace. From the hardware store behind her, she heard two men talking without bothering to lower their voices. The woman Hurst turned down at the station. Heard she came 4 days on the train. Brought a kid too. No wonder he sent her back. Clara faced forward and did not turn around. This was a skill she had developed since Daniel. The ability to hold very still while something moved through her that she couldn't afford to let out. Ethan had heard. She could tell by the way he chewed more slowly. He did not say anything. "Finish your roll," she told him. He finished it. She had started back toward the boarding house to think when she heard it. Hoofbeats. Coming from the north end of the street, unhurried, the easy rhythm of a horse that had been ridden a long way and was almost done. She didn't look up right away. There were horses on the street all day. But something about the pace made her turn. The man who pulled up near her was not what she expected, though she wasn't sure what she'd expected. He was somewhere in his late 30s, lean, the way men who worked outdoors were lean, with dust on his coat that hadn't been brushed, and a face that had seen enough weather to have opinions about it. He wasn't looking at the street. He was looking at her. He stopped the horse and dismounted in a single motion that suggested he'd done it more times than he could count. "Ma'am?" he said. His voice was flat country, Kansas or thereabouts. "You'd be Clara Whitmore." It was not a question, which was itself strange. I would, she said carefully. And you are? Wyatt Callahan. He said it like he expected the name to land somewhere and wasn't sure it would. I work for Margaret Holloway over at Pine Ridge. She asked me to come find you. Find me? Clara studied him. You don't know me. No, ma'am. But word travels in this territory faster than most people account for. Margaret heard what happened at the station. She's got a proposition if you're willing to hear it. He glanced down at Ethan, and something shifted in his expression. Not pity, exactly, but something that acknowledged the boy as a person rather than a complication. Both of you. Clara looked at him for a long moment. She had trusted a letter from a stranger once and stood on a platform being stared at by 47 people. She was aware of this. She was also aware that she had $11, one more night in a boarding house, and no discernible path forward. What kind of proposition? She said. She runs a settlement, small one, northwest of here, day and a half by wagon. She's got families there, children, no proper school. She needs someone who can teach. He paused. She wanted you to know there was a place that wasn't going to look at you the way this town did. The bluntness of that last sentence caught her off guard. She hadn't expected him to say it directly. Men like him usually worked around the difficult thing. You know what happened yesterday, she said. Most of the territory knows by now, he said without cruelty. I'm sorry about that. I am. But Margaret thought knowing that might make the offer make more sense. So you'd understand she's not doing charity. She needs a teacher. She just also wanted you to know the other part. Ethan had been listening to all of this with the absolute attention of a child who knows that a decision about his life is being made. His role was gone. His eyes were on Wyatt Callahan with an expression that was something between suspicion and desperate hope, the particular cocktail that comes from being 6 years old and already understanding that adults make promises they don't always keep. Where's Pine Ridge? Clara said. Wyatt turned and pointed roughly northwest. Day and a half if the road cooperates. Sometimes it doesn't. And Mrs. Holloway, she knows about Ethan. She knows. Something in his voice suggested he'd made certain of it. Clara put her hand on Ethan's shoulder. She felt him lean into it, slightly, the way he always did without seeming to realize he was doing it. Give me until noon, she said. I need to think. I'll be at the livery, Wyatt said. He said it without pressure, which she noted. He didn't push. He tipped his hat, not a performative gesture, just reflex, and led his horse down the street. She sat in the room until 11 and did not think so much as feel her way through it, the way she always had when logic ran out. She had been raised to be cautious, to measure, to not give trust away carelessly, and all of that had served her until Daniel died, and then had become something else. A kind of paralysis disguised as prudence. She'd been so careful for 2 years. Careful hadn't gotten her anywhere except a depot platform in Arizona with $11. She thought about Ethan at the station, the way he'd said, "Where are we going now?" with perfect trust in her ability to answer, even while she had no answer. She packed the bag. She left the key on the desk without waking the proprietress, because she had already paid and did not want to stand through another assessing look. At noon, she found Wyatt Callahan at the livery, wagon hitched and ready, which told her he had assumed she would come, or had hoped for it enough that he'd prepared anyway. She wasn't sure which. She wasn't sure it mattered. She put the suitcase in the back of the wagon. Ethan climbed up before she lifted him, which made Wyatt notice, which she caught. He's capable, she said, mildly, settling beside him. I can see that, Wyatt said. He clicked to the horse, and the wagon moved. The road north was rough before they'd cleared Silver Creek's last building. Claire had traveled enough to understand that wagon travel in the territories bore no relationship to what people imagined when they sat in comfortable rooms and discussed the frontier. The wheels found every break in the hard pan. The sun was direct and without mercy. The landscape, all scrub brush and pale rock, and the occasional desperate tree, offered nothing to look at that suggested human life had much foothold here. Ethan sat between them on the bench and watched the country with the focused interest of a child who has decided to understand his situation by collecting information about it. After an hour of silence, he said, Do you have a horse? Wyatt glanced down at him. I do. Name's Clover. Ethan considered this. That's a good name for a horse. She thinks so. The boy almost smiled. Clara watched him almost smile and felt something loosen in her chest, very slightly, like a knot that has been pulled tight for months, giving just 1 millimeter. You been to Pine Ridge before? She asked Wyatt. Live there, he said. Have for 3 years. Margaret Holloway. She's a good person? He took a moment before answering. Not because he was uncertain, she thought, but because he was choosing what was actually true rather than what was easy. She's a fair person. Fair's rarer out here than good, if you want my honest read. Clara looked at the road ahead. How many families? 8, right now. Half of them lost somebody. Come to Pine Ridge because there wasn't anywhere else. He paused. It's a familiar situation out there. She understood what he meant and didn't press it. They rode until the sun was low and the temperature dropped faster than seemed possible. Wyatt stopped at a place where a dry creek bed widened enough to offer some shelter from the wind, and they made camp with the functional efficiency of people who have no energy left for anything but what's necessary. He built a fire. She heated water and opened the provisions she'd bought in Silver Creek. Ethan fell asleep against her arm before his food was half eaten. In the firelight, with the boy sleeping and the desert quiet in that peculiar way it goes quiet after dark, not peaceful exactly, but empty in a way that feels like the land holding its breath. Clara said, What did you do? Before Pine Ridge, Wyke? Wyatt was quiet for long enough that she thought he wasn't going to answer. Then, things I'm not proud of. That's not an answer. No, he agreed. He looked at the fire. My brother died 7 years ago. We were running cattle for a man who didn't deserve the cattle or the men. My brother died because of choices that man made, and afterward I made some choices of my own. Bad ones. He stopped. I'm not going to dress it up. I hurt people who didn't deserve to be hurt. I told myself I had reasons. The reasons weren't worth what they cost. She watched him say it. He didn't look away from the fire, and he didn't perform contrition, and he didn't ask her for anything in response. Not forgiveness, not absolution, not even understanding. He just said it. How long ago did you stop? She said. The choices? 4 years. And since then? Since then, I've been trying to be somebody worth knowing. He said it simply, without bitterness. Some days I do better than others. The fire popped. Somewhere out in the dark, something moved through the brush, and then didn't. Clara shifted Ethan's weight against her shoulder. You came to find me yourself, she said. Margaret could have sent someone else. She did send someone else. He almost smiled. I volunteered to come instead. Why? He looked at her across the fire for a moment. Because I thought you'd be more likely to trust a person who came themselves than a person who sent somebody. It was the kind of thing you could only know if you'd spent time thinking about what trust looked like from the outside. She filed that away. We should sleep, she said. We should, he agreed, and didn't say anything else. Chaps. But the second day was harder. The road worsened in a way that felt personal. Ruts so deep the wagon lurched sideways and twice nearly stuck. A rear wheel cracked in the early afternoon, and Wyatt spent 40 minutes on his back in the dirt, finding a fix that would hold long enough to get them where they were going. His hands were bleeding when he stood up, and he wiped them on his trousers and said nothing about it. Ethan, who had been watching from beside the wagon, said, Can I help with anything? Wyatt looked at him. You know how to hold a horse still? Yes, sir. Then you already did. Ethan stood straighter. Clara watched this and said nothing, because saying something would have diminished it somehow. The sky went the color of iron in the late afternoon, and the wind came up and smelled like rain. Wyatt said, We're going to hit it, and they hit it. A hard desert rain that came sideways and lasted 20 minutes and left the road a different thing entirely, softer and more treacherous. The horses picking their way through with the cautious bad temper of animals doing a job they hadn't agreed to. They rolled into Pine Ridge just before dark, wet and road-rattled and tired in that deep way that lives in the bones. Clara saw it through the rain, a cluster of buildings, lights in the windows, smoke from chimneys. Not much by the measure of the places she'd come from, but lights in windows meant people, and people meant something was alive here. A woman appeared in the doorway of the largest building. She was perhaps 60, with gray hair and the posture of someone who had stopped worrying about whether she looked commanding and had simply become commanding through the accretion of necessary decisions. She watched them come in through the rain with an expression that was evaluating and warm at the same time, which Clara had not thought was possible. "You made it," the woman said. "Both of you." Her eyes moved to Ethan, and she did something Clara had not seen anyone do since Daniel. She addressed the boy directly, as a person, before she said anything else to the adults. "You must be Ethan. I'm Margaret. Are you hungry?" Ethan looked at her. He looked at his mother. He looked back. "Yes, ma'am," he said. "Good," said Margaret Holloway. "We've been waiting on both of you." Clara climbed down from the wagon into the mud and rain, and for the first time in as long as she could measure, she did not feel like she was arriving in a place that was deciding what to do with her. She felt, strangely, and without any good reason yet to feel it, like she had arrived somewhere that had been expecting her. She didn't trust the feeling. She'd learned enough to be careful with feelings like that. But she didn't push it away either. She picked up her suitcase and followed Margaret inside. Margaret Holloway's house was the kind of place that told you everything about the woman who lived in it before she said a word. Not because it was decorated or arranged with any particular intention, but because it wasn't. There were books stacked on a chair because someone had been reading them and set them down to do something else and hadn't gotten back to it. There was a coat on a hook that had been there long enough to have shaped itself to the hook. The kitchen smelled of coffee that had been on since morning and a pot of something on the stove that had been added to over the course of the day, rather than made all at once. It was a house where things happened and where the happening mattered more than the appearance of it. Clara stood in the doorway and dripped on the floor, and Margaret Holloway handed her a towel without fanfare, the way you hand a towel to someone you've been expecting. Ethan had already been seated at the kitchen table by a girl of perhaps 10 who had materialized from somewhere in the back of the house and introduced herself as Nora in the efficient way children do when they have decided a thing is their business. She set a bowl in front of him. Ethan looked at it, then at Clara, and Clara nodded, and he ate. Wyatt had taken the horses. Claire could hear him outside, the sounds of tack being removed and horses being settled, the low particular sounds of work being done in the dark and the rain by a person who knows exactly what they're doing. "Sit," Margaret said. It wasn't unkind. It was just the word, direct, and Clara sat. The stew was thick and had been cooking long enough that the vegetables had given up their shape and become part of something else. Clara ate without tasting it for the first several bites, the way you eat when your body is asking for fuel rather than pleasure. Then it registered, and she slowed down and tasted it, and it was good. "The school," Clara said, when she had eaten enough to feel capable of conversation. Margaret sat across from her, both hands around a coffee mug. "What about it? Tell me what you actually have. Not the best version, what it actually is." The older woman looked at her for a moment, reassessing something. "One room, roof holds mostly. There are 11 children in the settlement right now, ages 5 through 14. Books. I have maybe a dozen. 3 slates. The last teacher we had left in March, which wasn't his fault. His mother was sick in Ohio." She paused. "The children have been without instruction for 4 months. What do the parents expect? Reading, arithmetic, some writing. The older ones, some of them have ideas about what their children should be. I try not to discourage that." She said it carefully, which told Clara there was more behind it. There are some families here who came from places where their children were told early what they were allowed to become. I don't run things that way. Clara absorbed this. And what do they know right now, the children? Varies considerably. The oldest, a boy named James, he's 14, can read well and does sums faster than I can. The youngest 4 can't read at all. The middle ones are scattered. It's not a neat situation. "No," Clara said. "They rarely are." From across the table, Ethan looked up from his bowl. "I can read," he said, apparently feeling this was relevant information to contribute. Margaret looked at him with the direct attention she'd given him outside, not the tolerant attention of an adult managing a child, but the actual attention of someone interested. "What are you reading?" "We finished Robinson Crusoe," Ethan said. "Mostly Mama reads it, but I read the parts I know. That's a long book for 6. We've been at it a while, Clara said. Margaret nodded slowly, and Clara couldn't tell what conclusion she'd reached, only that she'd reached one. Wyatt came in from outside, wet and carrying the smell of horse and rain, and went straight to the basin to wash his hands without being directed to. There was something in that small thing, the automatic courtesy of it, the absence of needing to be reminded, that Clara noted and set aside. "Roads are worse than when I left," he said to Margaret, drying his hands. "That stretch before the creek bed is going to be mud for a week." "It can be mud," Margaret said. "We're not going anywhere." He poured himself coffee and leaned against the counter with the ease of a man in a place he considers home, but not so comfortably that he forgot there were other people in the room. He looked at Clara. "Room's ready if you want to get the boy to bed. 3rd door on the left upstairs." "There's a trundle," Margaret added. "For him." Ethan, who had been doing his best to stay awake through the conversation on the grounds that sleep would end it, had gone soft around the edges, in the way children do when exhaustion overrules willpower. His chin was doing that thing where it dropped, and then he caught himself. Clara touched his shoulder. "Come on." She carried him up the stairs, which she hadn't meant to do. He was getting heavy for it, but he turned his face into her neck the way he'd done when he was much smaller, and she carried him anyway. The room was small and had 2 windows, and the trundle pulled out from beneath the main bed with a scrape of wood that seemed very loud in the quiet house. She settled him into it, shoes already off, and he was asleep before she'd pulled the blanket to his chin. She stood in that room for longer than she needed to. Outside the window, the rain had quieted to a drizzle, and the settlement was dark except for 1 or 2 windows. She could see the outline of the other buildings, low, practical, close together in the way buildings cluster when people know the land around them is not reliably friendly. She had made a decision on $11 and no better options, and the word of a man she'd never met until yesterday. That was the truth of how she'd gotten here. The fact that it felt inexplicably like something other than desperation did not make it not desperation. She went back downstairs. Okay. Wyatt had gone. Margaret was still at the table with a second cup of coffee and a piece of paper she'd been writing on, which she set aside without hiding when Clara came in. "He goes home at night," Margaret said, answering the unasked question. "He has his own place, 50 yards east of here. He built it himself, which tells you something about the man?" "What does it tell me?" "That he doesn't expect other people to solve his problems." She said it without editorializing. "Sit. There are things I should tell you before tomorrow." Clara sat. "The settlement has been here 6 years," Margaret began. "I started it because I had land, and I had the particular stubbornness of a woman who had been told by enough people what couldn't be done that I stopped believing them. The people who came here, I didn't recruit them. They came because they'd run out of places that would have them." She stopped, turning her coffee mug. "I need you to understand that. This is not a community of people who had other good options. They chose Pine Ridge because Pine Ridge was what was left. Like me," Clara said. "Yes," Margaret said without apology. "Like you. And like Wyatt. And like myself, if I'm being honest about it." Claire looked at the table. "What happened to your husband?" Margaret was quiet for a moment. "He died 12 years ago. The land was his, and then it was mine, and then I had to decide what to do with it. It took a while to decide." She looked at Clara directly. "I'm telling you this so you know I'm not asking you to do anything I haven't done myself. Starting over in a place that doesn't know you, figuring out what you're worth when you can't use the old measures." Clara said, "The other families? How will they receive me?" "Some of them will be glad immediately. The Renner family. They have 3 children, no letters between them. They've been asking about schooling since they arrived. The Garza family, same. Others will need time. There's a man named Ed Pryor, who's been here 4 years and believes strongly that things ought to be decided by the people who were there first, which means he has opinions about newcomers." She said it plainly. "He won't be cruel. He'll just be watching." "I can manage being watched." "I thought you probably could." Margaret set down her cup. "The school building needs work before you can use it properly. Wyatt will help with that. The supplies, I've been collecting what I can, but it's not much. You'll have to figure out how to teach with what there is." "I've been doing that since I started," Clara said. "In Lawrence, I taught out of my kitchen for 8 months when the district ran out of money." Something shifted in Margaret's expression. Not surprise exactly, but the particular attention of a person who has just received information that confirms something they'd already suspected. You didn't mention that in the letters. I didn't know if it was relevant. It's relevant, Margaret said. The next morning arrived without ceremony, the way mornings in the territory did. Hard light through thin curtains, the sounds of the settlement waking up outside. Clara was up before Ethan, which was normal, and had found the kitchen and figured out the stove, which took 2 tries but not 3. She was at the window with coffee when she heard the first voices. 2 women outside, not loud, the kind of conversation carried on between people doing morning tasks, feeding, carrying, the domestic work that structures a day. She couldn't hear the words clearly. She caught her own name once, thought she caught it anyway, and made herself stop listening. Ethan came down the stairs sideways, one hand on the rail, still wearing the look of someone not yet fully committed to consciousness. "Is this where we live now?" he said. Clara poured him a cup of water and set it on the table. "For now." He climbed into a chair and put his chin in his hands. "I like it," he said, with the decisive simplicity of a child for whom the question of whether to like a place is a matter of immediate sensory judgment rather than lengthy deliberation. "You haven't seen it yet." "It smells good," he said, which she supposed was a reasonable basis for an opinion. Margaret appeared shortly after, already dressed and purposeful, and within an hour Clara was being walked through the settlement in what amounted to an informal introduction to everyone who was awake and outside. It was done without announcement, just Margaret and Clara moving from building to building, stopping to talk, and Margaret allowing people to figure out who Clara was by the process of conversation rather than by declaration. The Renner family came first. Tom Renner was a large, quiet man who worked in the manner of someone for whom silence is productive rather than uncomfortable. His wife Helen had the particular energy of a woman managing more than anyone knew and determined that no one would know it. Their 3 children, 2 girls and a boy, ages 9, 7, and 5, looked at Clara with the universal expression of children being introduced to a potential teacher, which combined hope and suspicion in roughly equal measure. "We've been trying with the letters," Helen Renner said, with a directness that Clara respected. "I only got so far myself and Tom's. Tom reads well enough for what he needs, but it's not the same as proper schooling." "What does the 9-year-old know?" Clara asked. Helen blinked. She'd apparently expected to be the one asking questions. "Ruth. She can make her letters, get some of the short words." "Good," Clara said. "That's a foundation." Ruth, standing slightly behind her mother and listening with the intent focus of a child who understands a decision is being made about her life, looked at Clara with careful brown eyes. Clara met them directly. "What do you want to be able to read?" Clara asked her. Ruth considered this seriously. "Everything," she said. Clara almost smiled. That's the right answer. The Garza family was next, Miguel and Rosaria and their 4 children, the oldest of whom was the 14-year-old James that Margaret had mentioned. Clara looked at him with genuine interest. He was tall for his age, with his father's jaw and his mother's eyes, and the particular bearing of a boy who had been the smartest person in many rooms and was tired of having no one to measure himself against. "Margaret says you can read well," Clara said to him. "Yes, ma'am. Not boastful. Just accurate." "What have you read?" He listed several books. Clara revised her assessment upward twice during the list. "Can you do fractions?" "Basic ones." "Then we'll start with long division and move toward algebra." Something changed in his expression. A careful containment, like a door opening just enough to let light through without committing to open. "There's a school in Tucson that takes advanced students," he said. "My mother found out about it." "Then let's get you ready for it," Clara said. Rosaria Garza, who had been listening to this exchange with the stillness of a woman who has learned that the most important conversations happen when you don't interrupt them, pressed her lips together once, quickly, in the way people do when they're fighting an emotion they don't want to show in public. Miguel Garza shook Clara's hand with the gravity of a man conducting real business. Ed Pryor was the last stop. He was working on a fence post at the edge of his property, and he didn't stop working when they approached, which was a choice, and they all knew it. He was perhaps 50, with the kind of build that came from decades of physical labor rather than anything cultivated. and a face that had organized itself over the years into an expression of permanent assessment. He looked at Clara the way he might look at a weather system, not hostilely, but with the measuring attention of someone who knows that what happens next depends on what this turns out to be. "Mrs. Whitmore," he said, "heard you came up from Silver Creek." "I did," she said. "Gerald Hurst's situation." She met his eyes. "Yes." He drove the post into the ground with 2 solid strikes, then straightened. "I've got 2 boys, 8 and 10. They need learning, and I know it." A pause. "I like to see how people handle things before I trust them with something that matters to me." "That's reasonable," Clara said. "Didn't say it was. Said it's what I do." He looked at her for another moment. "Margaret trusts you. I'll let that carry some weight. That's all I'm asking for right now." He nodded once, returned to the fence post. The conversation was over. Clara walked back toward the main house beside Margaret, and Margaret said nothing, which Clara understood was itself a kind of commentary, approving, or at least not the opposite. The school building was worse than she'd been prepared for, even after Margaret's description. The roof held, as promised, but only in the sense that it remained attached to the walls. There was a place near the northeast corner where light came through in a way that would become significantly more relevant in rain. The floor was packed earth with boards over part of it. There were 2 long benches and 1 table, and the 3 slates hung on the wall, 2 of them cracked. The window facing south had lost its shutter, and it lay propped against the outer wall where someone had left it after wind took it down. She stood in the middle of the room for a long time. Wyatt appeared in the doorway behind her. She hadn't heard him approach, which she'd noticed he was capable of, not sneaking exactly, just moving with an economy of sound that came from years of being somewhere where sound had consequences. "I know," he said. "When can you work on the roof corner?" "Started this morning. Need another day on it." He looked around the room with her. "I can fix the shutter today if you tell me that's more urgent." "The shutter," she said. "If it rains in that window, we lose the slates." He nodded and went for the shutter. Clara started moving the benches. They worked in the same space for most of the morning without much conversation, which was comfortable in a way she hadn't expected. The comfortable silence of 2 people doing separate tasks in a shared space, each aware of the other without requiring acknowledgement of it every few minutes. Wyatt reattached the shutter and found 2 boards that were lifting at the floor edge and re-nailed them without being asked. Clara organized the books into what she actually had versus what she wished she had, which was a disheartening exercise but a necessary one. Ethan appeared around mid-morning, having been released from the house by the absence of anyone telling him to stay in it, which was as good as permission as far as he was concerned. He stood in the doorway of the school and looked at what his mother was doing with the seriousness of a child deciding whether to involve himself. "Can I help?" he said to Wyatt, because Wyatt had the hammer. "Know how to hold a nail?" "I think so." "Then come here and I'll show you the right way." Clara watched Ethan cross the room and take up a position beside Wyatt on the floor near the loose boards, watching with absolute attention as Wyatt showed him how to set the nail before you drove it. Wyatt had a particular quality with the boy that she'd been trying to identify since the wagon. Not performing patience, not performing warmth, just treating him with the level of practical seriousness you'd give any person you were working alongside. It was, she realized, the thing Ethan had missed most and hadn't had words for. Ethan held his first nail crooked, and it bent. He looked stricken. "Happens," Wyatt said, pulling it out. "Try again." The second one went straight. Ethan looked at it for a moment and then looked up at Wyatt, and Wyatt said, "Good," without making a production of it, and moved on to the next board. Ethan held the next nail before he was asked to. Clara turned back to her books and did not make a face, because if she let herself feel the full weight of watching her son learn something from a man again, she would not get anything else done that day. By the end of the first week, she had a schedule. By the end of the second, she had 11 children showing up consistently, which was all of them, which she had not taken for granted even after the first week's good attendance. Children's attendance in frontier settlements was subject to weather, to harvest, to illness, to the endless competing demands of a life where everyone's labor was needed. She planned for absences and was pleased when they didn't materialize. James Garza was the complication she'd anticipated, and the pleasure she hadn't. He worked ahead of everything she assigned and then sat waiting, which would have made him a disruption if he'd been that kind of boy. But he wasn't. He waited with the quiet patience of someone who'd learned that moving too fast left others behind in ways that mattered. She started keeping a separate set of problems for him. Harder ones, things she worked out the night before that would take him the full period to finish. He never said thank you directly. What he did was come in early twice a week to have the previous day's work checked, which was its own form of appreciation. Ruth Renner progressed faster than her mother had suggested and slower than Clara had hoped, which was honest progress. She read short passages by the end of the second week, still sounding out each word, but with the expression of someone for whom the mechanism of reading was beginning to feel like a thing she owned rather than a thing being done to her. The two youngest children, a girl named Bess, whose family had arrived 2 weeks before Clara, and a boy named Samuel, whose father was Ed Pryor, could not read at all. Clara taught them the letters first, which was not interesting work for anyone involved, but which had to be done. And she made it slightly less uninteresting by writing the letters in the dirt floor of the school first, so they could trace them with their fingers before they moved to the slates. Samuel Pryor, who was 8 and had his father's assessment-heavy way of looking at things, asked her after 3 days why they were doing dirt. "Because the slates are cracked, and I don't want you cutting your fingers," she said, which was true, and also because feeling a letter is different from seeing it, which she'd found helped certain children hold the shape in memory. She didn't explain the second part because Samuel didn't need the theory. He needed the letters. "My dad says you came from Silver Creek," Samuel said, tracing a capital A with his index finger. "I did." "He says you were supposed to get married there." "That's right." Samuel traced a B slowly. "What happened?" The man changed his mind. Samuel considered this with the pragmatic seriousness of a child to whom adult decisions are data points rather than occasions for judgment. "Was he mean?" "He was something," Clara said. "Try the C." Samuel tried the C. It came out backwards. "Other way," she said, and he tried again. The thing with Wyatt happened by accumulation rather than by event, which was probably the only way it could have happened with two people who were both accustomed to being careful. He came by the school building most mornings. There was always something that needed fixing, or he was delivering supplies from the general run into Silver Creek, or he was simply passing on the way to something else and stopped. He was not intrusive about it. He arrived with a specific purpose, did the thing, and left unless asked to stay, which was the behavior of a man who understood the difference between helping and occupying. She asked him things about the territory, about the families, about the history of the land and who had claimed what and why it mattered. He answered without embellishment and without the particular condescension of men who answered women's practical questions as though the questions themselves were remarkable for coming from women. He just answered. She told him things in return, in the incremental way she'd always offered information, piece by piece, testing each piece before offering the next. About Daniel, who had been good and funny and careful with money and had caught a fever in the winter of 1876 and been gone in 11 days, which was still the most incomprehensible thing that had ever happened to her. About Lawrence and the kitchen school and the mothers who sent their children with apologies for not being able to pay, and the children who came anyway and were worth every hour. About the letters from Gerald Hurst, which she'd believed because she'd wanted to believe them, which she could admit now in a way she couldn't have in Kansas. Wyatt listened the way people do when they're not forming their response while you talk, just listening. "You don't say much," she said once, not critically. "I found that's usually better," he said. "Better than what?" "Than saying things I'd need to correct later." She thought about this. "Is that from experience?" "Hard experience," he said, without self-pity. One evening, 3 weeks in, he was at the school fixing the northeast roof corner, still unfinished because he'd had to source additional shingles from a man 2 settlements over. Ethan was there, which was now a regular feature of Wyatt's repair work, handing things up when asked and asking questions at a rate that would have exhausted most adults. Wyatt answered each one with the same uncondescending directness he used with Clara. "Why do the shingles go that way?" Ethan asked. "So the rain runs off instead of in. What if they were the other way?" Then you'd have a wet floor. Could you fix it if that happened? Yes, but you'd have to dry the floor first. How long does that take? Wyatt paused. Depends how wet. Ethan sat with this answer. Clara, below them on the bench, could hear the conversation without looking up from the papers she was reviewing for the next day's lessons, and she was aware of an unreasonable contentment that she did not entirely trust, and was choosing, for now, not to examine too closely. Wyatt, Ethan said. Are you going to stay here? In Pine Ridge? A beat. Planning on it. Good, Ethan said with the finality of a verdict rendered. Wyatt said nothing back, which was either because he had nothing to say or because the thing that occurred to him to say wasn't something he was going to say in front of Clara. She kept her eyes on her papers. The roof work continued above her in the particular rhythm of a man doing something he knows how to do. And outside the window, the settlement was quieting into evening, and she thought, with the careful, provisional quality of a thought you don't say aloud yet, that she had made the right decision with her $11 and her absence of options. It wasn't certainty. She'd learned enough to mistrust certainty. But it was something, and after the year she'd had, something was not nothing. The trouble arrived the way most trouble did in the territory. Not announced, not dramatic in its first appearance, just a man on a horse moving at the unhurried pace of someone who already knows the answer to every question he's about to ask. Clara was in the school when it happened. She had her back to the door, writing the day's arithmetic problem on the board, long division for James, simpler multiplication for the middle group, when she heard the sound of hoofbeats on the settlement road, more than one horse, and the particular silence that followed them, not the ordinary silence of a settlement mid-morning, the silence of people who have stopped what they were doing to watch something. She set down the chalk. Ruth Renner, who was in the front row with her slate, looked toward the window. James Garza, who always noticed everything, had already turned in his seat. "Keep working," Claire said, and went to the door. There were 3 horses stopped in front of Margaret's house. The man in the center was perhaps 55, broad through the shoulders in a way that had once been muscle and was now something else, dressed in the clothes of a man who had money to spend on clothes, and spent it without much taste. He was looking at the settlement with the particular expression of a person who owns something in their mind before they own it in any legal sense. Margaret was on her porch. Her posture told Clara everything before she was close enough to hear the conversation. She crossed the yard, aware of curtains moving in the Renner and Garza windows, aware of Ed Pryor materializing at the edge of his fence line with the specific stillness of a man who is watching something he has been expecting. "I'm not interested in what you consider fair market," Margaret was saying when Clara reached the steps. Her voice was level, which on Margaret meant something was wrong. When things were going well, she had inflection. Level meant she was controlling something. The man on the center horse looked down at her the way men do when they've arranged themselves on horseback for exactly the advantage the height gives them. "Mrs. Holloway, I'm not making threats. I'm describing a situation. The land east of Pine Creek runs to my property line according to the original survey. If that survey was wrong, that's a problem for everyone involved, not just me." "The survey was not wrong," Margaret said. "I have the documents." "Then we're in agreement," the man said, smiling in a way that did not agree with anything. He had the smile of a man who uses pleasantness the way other men use a blade, to get close before the damage. "I'd just like to see them, professionally. With my man present," he gestured to the rider on his left, who had the look of someone hired to look like a lawyer. "Just to confirm we're all reading them the same way." "We're reading them correctly," Margaret said. "We've been reading them correctly for 6 years. Clara had reached the edge of the porch steps. The man's eyes moved to her, the quick calculating assessment of someone cataloging what he sees. And then back to Margaret with the deliberate dismissal of someone who has decided she's not relevant yet. "And you are," Clara said. He looked back at her, apparently surprised she'd spoken. "Randall Voss," he said after a beat. "I own Voss Range, north and east of here." "I know who you are," Margaret said flatly. She had told Clara about Voss 3 weeks earlier, in one of the evening conversations that had become their regular practice. Margaret talking through the history of the territory the way you'd walk someone through a house, showing them which floors were solid and which ones you had to know how to step on. Randall Voss had come to the territory 12 years ago with Eastern money and had spent those 12 years buying land at prices that were technically legal and practically predatory, particularly from families who hit bad seasons and didn't understand what they were signing. Margaret had watched him take 3 properties in the past 2 years. She had watched it and documented it and told no one except Wyatt, because there was nothing to do about it until there was. Voss seemed to find something in Margaret's flatness that satisfied him, the way a man sometimes feels more certain when the opposition stops pretending to be cordial. "I'll be sending someone out to look at those survey documents by end of month," he said. "That's all I'm asking." "I heard you," Margaret said. "I'll have my answer ready when you send them." He held her gaze for a moment, testing it, the way you test a door to see if it's locked. And then he turned his horse without hurry, and the 3 of them rode back up the settlement road at the same unhurried pace they'd come in on. The silence they left behind had a different quality than the one before they'd arrived. Dear, Margaret sat at her kitchen table that evening with 3 documents spread in front of her, and the particular stillness of a woman doing arithmetic that doesn't come out right no matter how many times she runs it. Clara sat across from her. Wyatt stood at the window where he'd been standing since he arrived 20 minutes earlier, after Margaret had sent for him through Ed Pryor, who had apparently needed no persuasion to go immediately. "The original survey," Margaret said, "puts the eastern boundary of Pine Ridge land at Pine Creek itself. Not 50 yards east of it, not the center of it. The creek." She pressed her finger to the document. "This line." "And Voss's claim," Wyatt said, without turning from the window. "His deed was recorded in Tucson in 1881, 2 years after mine." She looked at the papers. "But someone altered the survey reference in the county records. I've been to the land office in Silver Creek twice, and both times I was told the records were consistent. Both times I came home with copies that don't match what I have here." She sat back. "Someone changed the line. In the county records, not in my original deed. My deed says the creek. The county records now say 50 yards west of the creek, which would put his eastern boundary 200 yards inside Pine Ridge." Wyatt finally turned from the window. "How much land?" 2 families. Pryor's fence line, part of the east pasture I've been running cattle on since the beginning." "That's not nothing," Wyatt said. "It's everything if it works," Margaret said. "If he takes the east pasture, we lose the grazing that carries us through winter. Without that—" She stopped herself. "But more than the land. If he can show a legal claim to any part of this settlement, he files for the rest. He's done it before. He did it to the Harmon family in 1882, filed on a piece, clouded the title to the rest, and when they couldn't afford to fight it in Tucson, they took what he offered for the whole property." She folded her hands on the table. "I'm not taking what he offers." Clara had been listening to this with the particular attention of someone learning a new country's geography. She looked at the documents on the table. "May I?" Margaret pushed them toward her. She read slowly because she wasn't familiar with the language of survey records, and she wanted to read it rather than assume it. The original deed was written in the formal hand of a territorial land office in 1877, Clara's name, Margaret Holloway, in the property owner line, the boundaries described in the long, specific way of survey documents that give measurements in chains and reference permanent markers. Then the second document, the copy from the county record office. She put them side by side. The difference was not subtle if you were looking for it. The original said Pine Creek East Bank. The county record said a point 50 yards west of Pine Creek East Bank. "Who has access to county records?" Clara said. "The county clerk and whoever he decides to allow," Margaret said. "His name is Arthur Denny. He's been clerk for 4 years." She looked at Wyatt. "He and Voss went to school together in Ohio." Wyatt's jaw tightened, not in surprise, in recognition. "Does anyone else have the original?" Clara said. "What do you mean?" "Your deed. Who witnessed it? Who recorded it originally? Is there a third copy anywhere?" Margaret was quiet for a moment. "The original recording was done at the Territorial Land Office in Prescott, not the county office. Prescott would have the registration copy." "Have you asked Prescott?" Margaret looked at her, then at the documents, then back at Clara with an expression that moved through several stages quickly and settled on something complicated. I haven't been to Prescott since 1877. I've been dealing with Silver Creek because it's the county seat. I assumed... She stopped. I assumed the county records were the county records. They're supposed to be, Clara said. But if someone altered the county copy, they can't alter the Prescott copy. That one was made at registration, sealed, and filed. It would still say the creek. The silence in the kitchen was different now. Still serious, but with something in it that hadn't been there before. You know about land records, Wyatt said, looking at her. My husband spent 6 months fighting a property line dispute in Lawrence, Clara said, before Ethan was born. The neighbor claimed our fence was 12 feet onto his land. Daniel went to the county clerk. The county clerk was the neighbor's cousin, and we lost the first filing. Then he found the original plat from the state land office, and it was settled in 2 weeks. She paused. He taught himself everything about it. I read what he read because there wasn't anything else to do in the evenings. Wyatt looked at Margaret. Margaret looked at the documents. Prescott is 3 days by stage, Wyatt said. Then someone should go, Clara said. The decision about who would go to Prescott was not settled that night. It was settled the next morning when Wyatt came to the school before the children arrived and told Clara he was going, and Margaret was staying because someone had to stay, and he'd be back in a week with whatever the territorial office had. Take someone with you, Clara said. Tom Renner offered. Good. He stood in the doorway in the early light with his hat in his hand, which was a thing she'd noticed he did when he was about to say something he'd considered. While I'm gone, he said, Voss may send someone, or come himself. I know. Don't sign anything. Don't let anyone look at Margaret's documents without Margaret present and Ed Pryor in the room. Wyatt? I know you know. I'm saying it anyway. She looked at him. Come back with the document. That's the plan, he said. He put his hat on. Ethan's going to ask where I am. I'll tell him. He nodded. There was a beat where something else was clearly being considered and just as clearly not being said. And then he turned and left, and she watched him go across the yard with the particular sensation of watching something leave that you have not yet admitted matters to you. The week without him was harder than she would have predicted, which was information about herself that she filed away and didn't look at too directly. The children came to school. Ruth Renner sounded out her first complete sentence on Thursday and looked up from the slate with an expression that Clara would remember for a long time. The expression of a person who has just discovered that a door they didn't know existed has been standing open their whole life. James Garza finished the set of algebra problems Clara had prepared for the whole week in 2 days and asked very carefully whether there was anything harder. She gave him the next set, and he looked at it the way someone looks at something they've been wanting for a long time and finally have in front of them. Bess, the girl whose family had arrived just before Clara, was struggling with the letters in a way that was different from the normal struggle of not yet knowing them. She knew them. She had learned them. But when she tried to put them into words, something slowed. Some connection didn't complete the way it should. Clara had seen this before in Lawrence, in one boy who'd taken 3 times as long as the others to read, but who, once he had it, read with more retention than any of them. She adjusted her approach with Bess without making an adjustment of it, without naming the difficulty, just changing the method and watching what happened. Bess made progress on Friday. It was small progress, 4 words strung together haltingly, but it was progress and it was hers. And when she looked up, Clara said only, again, and Bess went again. On the 4th day, Voss sent someone, not himself, a man named Cutter, who had the look of someone employed for his capacity to stand in doorways and be large in them. He came to Margaret's house in the early afternoon and asked, with the excessive pleasantness of a man who doesn't need to be pleasant, whether Mrs. Holloway had given any thought to Mr. Voss's proposal. Clara was there. She had made a point of being there when she was not in school, because Wyatt had asked her to be and because she had her own reasons. Mrs. Holloway has given it the thought it deserves, Clara said, before Margaret could answer. Tell Mr. Voss we're not in a position to discuss the property boundaries until we've had time to review all relevant documentation. Cutter looked at her with the slow assessment of a man recalibrating who he's dealing with. And you are? I'm the person answering your question, Clara said. A beat. Mr. Voss isn't a patient man. Mr. Voss's patience is his own business, Clara said. Our answer is the same regardless of his timeline. He looked at Margaret, who was standing behind Clara with an expression that was not entirely readable but which did not contradict anything Clara had said. He looked back at Clara, made his internal calculation, and left. Margaret exhaled slowly. That was either very good or very bad. It was necessary, Clara said. If we'd engaged with the substance, he'd report back that we're uncertain. This way he reports that we're not moving. Are we not moving? Not until Wyatt gets back. Margaret was quiet for a moment. You've done this before. Not exactly this. She sat down at the table. Daniel did. I watched. You did more than watch, Margaret said. You understood it. Clara didn't answer that. She pulled the kettle off the heat and poured 2 cups. On the 6th day, Ed Pryor came to her. He didn't knock. He appeared in the school doorway during the afternoon lesson and stood there with his hat in his hands, which on Ed Pryor was the equivalent of another man dropping to his knees. The children looked at him. Clara told James to continue the problem on the board and stepped outside. Pryor, she said. He was looking at the ground, which was also not a thing he normally did. My east fence line, he said. If Voss gets that land. He's not getting it. If he does. He looked up. My cattle run that east pasture from November through March. Without it, he stopped. He was not a man who explained himself easily, and she could see the effort of it. I know, she said. My boys, he said. The word came out differently than his other words. I've been trying to build something here, for them. It's not much, but it's... He stopped again. It's enough, Clara said. And we're going to keep it. He looked at her with the assessing look he gave everything, but this time there was something behind it. He'd been watching her for 6 weeks with the careful attention of a man who trusted slowly and wanted to know what something was before he committed to it. She had been aware of being watched, and had said nothing about it, and had simply done the thing she did, which was the only answer to that kind of watching. I voted against Margaret sending for you, he said. When she told us she was bringing in a teacher from Silver Creek, I thought, he worked at something. I thought we didn't need an outsider, thought we could manage. That's a reasonable thing to think. It wasn't, as it turned out. He put his hat back on. My boys are reading. Samuel spelled 17 words right on Thursday. He told me at supper. He said it with the contained intensity of a man for whom the number 17 is a significant number. I'm not saying I was wrong about everything, but I was wrong about that. Clara said, the document that proves your fence line is right where it should be. Wyatt is bringing it back from Prescott. You sure? I'm sure the document exists. I'm sure it says what it says. Whether it's enough depends on what Voss is willing to do when he runs out of legal ground. She held his gaze. That part I'm less certain about, but the document is real. Ed Pryor nodded once, in the way he nodded when a thing was settled in his mind. I'll talk to the other men about being ready. Ready for what? Whatever he does when the legal ground runs out, he said, and walked back toward his fence line. Wyatt came back on the evening of the 7th day, later than expected, which Clara had spent 3 hours not thinking about. He came through the door of Margaret's house with road dust on everything, and a leather case under his arm that he set on the table with the care of something that had taken a week to carry. Got it, he said. Margaret opened the case. Clara stood beside her, and they looked at the document together. The territorial registration copy of the original Pine Ridge deed, dated 1877, sealed with the Territorial Land Office stamp, the boundary line reading precisely and unambiguously, Pine Creek, East Bank. Margaret sat down in her chair and put both hands flat on the table and said nothing for a moment. Tom Renner, who had come back with Wyatt and was still standing near the door, said, There's more. Wyatt reached into the inside pocket of his coat and put a second paper on the table. County Land Records for 1882, original filing date of Voss's deed. It was recorded by Arthur Denny, same as Margaret's copies showed, but there's a notation I found in the register margin, an amendment filed in 1883, 2 years after Voss's deed. Clara looked at the notation, then at Wyatt. An amendment to the survey description. filed without the property owner's knowledge or consent, as far as I can read it. The territorial registrar in Prescott had a copy because amendments are supposed to be forwarded. He'd never been asked about it. No one had. He let that settle. The registrar in Prescott is a man named George Alcott, 62 years old, been in that office since territorial organization, doesn't like Voss and doesn't like what this looks like. Will he testify to it? Margaret said. He'll write a statement. He can't make the stage trip himself. His health isn't good. But he'll put it in writing, signed, notarized. Clara looked at the papers spread across the table. The original deed, the territorial registration, the amendment notation and its date, the registrar's written account. Separately, each one was a piece of something. Together they were a clear and documentable case of fraudulent alteration of a public record. Voss didn't think anyone would go to Prescott, she said. No one ever has, Margaret said quietly. In 12 years of him doing this. No one had the original document and the knowledge that the Prescott copy existed and the money for the stage fare all at the same time. We didn't have the money either, Wyatt said, looking at Clara. Tom fronted the fare. We'll pay him back. Tom Renner shook his head once, which apparently meant don't worry about it, and stayed quiet. Clara thought about Gerald Hurst on the platform at Silver Creek. She thought about $11 in a suitcase and the particular desperation of a decision made because there was no better option. She thought about Daniel sitting at their kitchen table in Lawrence with land survey documents spread exactly like these, teaching himself the language of them because someone had to, and it might as well be him. She thought about Ethan, who was upstairs right now reading a page of Robinson Crusoe by himself in the lamplight, sounding out the harder words quietly so as not to disturb anyone. We need to get this to a territorial judge, she said. Alcott gave me a name, Wyatt said. Judge Henry Farwell in Tucson. He's heard land fraud cases before. He's not Voss's friend. He looked at Margaret. We'll need to make the trip, you and I, with the documents. When? Margaret said. Soon, before Voss gets wind that we've been to Prescott. Once he knows we have this, he'll start working on other angles. Wyatt said it without drama, just the flat assessment of someone who had watched enough men like Voss operate to know their patterns. Margaret looked at the papers once more. Then she looked at Clara. You found the path, she said. The Prescott question. Daniel found it first, Clara said, in Lawrence. You remembered it when it mattered, Margaret said. That counts. Outside the window, Pine Ridge was going dark for the night, lamps coming on in the Renner house and the Garza house, somewhere a child's voice calling something Clara couldn't quite make out. The settlement she had arrived at on $11 and no better options, in the rain, carried in by a man she'd met 2 days before, had become in 6 weeks something she could describe as home without the word feeling dishonest. She wouldn't have said that out loud to anyone yet, but she thought it. Wyatt was standing near the door with the road dust still on him, and she was aware, with the particular awareness of a person who has been careful about something for long enough that the carefulness itself becomes exhausting, that she was glad he was back. Not just because of the documents, because he was back. She didn't say that either. Go sleep, she told him instead. You've been 3 days on a stage. He looked at her. The corner of his mouth moved, which was the most expression she'd seen on him in 7 days of proximity. Yes, ma'am, he said, and went out. Margaret gathered the documents carefully and folded them back into the leather case, her hands moving with the particular deliberateness of someone handling something they are going to keep safe this time. She did not speak while she did it. She didn't need to. Clara went upstairs and found Ethan asleep with the book open on his chest, the lamp still lit beside him. She moved the book, closed it to the page, set it on the side table. She turned down the lamp. He made a small sound in his sleep, shifted, and was still. She sat on the edge of the bed in the dark for a moment. Just sat there. The settlement was quiet and the night was clear, and somewhere east of them was a man named Randall Voss, who believed the land already belonged to him in the only way that mattered to him. In his mind, in his plans, in the architecture of what he intended. He had been doing this for 12 years, and no one had stopped him, because no one had been able to find all the pieces at the same time. They had the pieces now. What Voss would do when he understood that was not yet certain. and she knew it. Ed Pryor knew it. Wyatt knew it. The word ready that Pryor had used, ready for whatever comes when the legal ground runs out, was not a comfort exactly. It was just the honest description of the next problem. But the document was real. The boundary was where it had always been. And 6 weeks ago, she had been a woman standing on a platform with nowhere to go, and now she was in a room above a settlement she had helped hold together for one more night, and her son was asleep with a book he'd been reading himself, and she thought, as carefully and provisionally as she'd thought anything since Daniel, that she was not done yet. Not by a long measure. They left for Tucson on a Tuesday, before the settlement was fully awake. Margaret had prepared for the trip with the methodical care of a woman who understood that how you carry a thing matters as much as what you carry. The leather case with the documents went into a second bag, wrapped in oilcloth, and the second bag went inside her traveling trunk with her clothes packed around it. She had written out a summary of the case in her own hand, dates, document references, the registrar's name in Prescott, the specific language of the boundary alteration, because she'd learned long ago that the person who controls the narrative of a legal dispute is often the person who walks in with the clearest paper trail. Wyatt drove the wagon. Tom Renner came as far as the Silver Creek Junction and then turned back because someone capable had to stay, and Tom Renner was, without question, capable. They shook hands at the junction in the early light without much ceremony, which was the way men like them conducted the things that mattered. Clara stood at the edge of the settlement road and watched the wagon until it rounded the first bend in the hills and disappeared. She was aware of the specific weight of watching Margaret go, which was not just the weight of concern for the trip, but the weight of being left in charge of something without anyone having formally said she was in charge of something. It had happened by accumulation, the way everything in Pine Ridge happened. Margaret had stopped asking her opinion and started assuming it would be the same as her own, which was either trust or efficiency, and was probably both. She turned back toward the settlement. Ethan was waiting by the school door with his slate under his arm. "Are they going to fix it?" he said. "That's the plan." "What if the judge doesn't believe them?" Clara pulled the school door open. "Then we find another judge," she said. "Come on." The children were quieter than usual that morning. Children absorbed the mood of the adults around them, the way dry ground absorbs rain, completely and without effort. And the adults of Pine Ridge had been moving through their days for the past week with the particular tightness of people waiting for something to resolve. Clara noticed it in the way Ruth held her slate, more carefully than she needed to, like she was protecting it. She noticed it in the way James Garza worked his problems, faster, with less of the sideways thinking he usually brought to them, just wanting to get through. She didn't address it directly. She taught the morning lesson, and when it was done, she kept the children an extra quarter hour, telling them the story of a man who had taken a survey of a piece of land and gotten every measurement wrong because he hadn't accounted for a bend in the river, and how the whole county had to be remeasured from scratch, and all the things that had been believed to be true for 20 years turned out to be slightly off. She made it funny in the places where it could be funny. By the time she let them go, the classroom had a different quality in it. Ruth stopped at the door on her way out. "Is that a real story?" "Parts of it," Clara said. Ruth considered this with the serious, evaluative expression she gave most things. The river part seemed real. "Rivers are always real," Clara said. "Everything else is arguable." Ruth appeared to find this satisfying and left. Voss arrived on the third day. Not Cutter this time, not a representative. Voss himself, with 4 riders behind him, which was more men than a business call required and fewer than a threat needed to be explicit. He rode into Pine Ridge at mid-morning and stopped in the center of the settlement road in a way that required people to notice him, which was the point. Clara was in the school. She heard the horses and she heard the silence that followed, and she went to the window without going to the door. She could see Voss from there, and she could see Ed Pryor coming out of his house with his hat already on, which meant he'd heard them from inside. She told James to watch the younger children, and she went out. Pryor reached Voss first. He stood in the road with his hands at his sides in the particular way of a man who is very deliberately not reaching for anything, and said, "Mr. Voss, Mrs. Holloway's not here." "I can see that," Voss said. He was looking around the settlement with the proprietary expression Clara had seen on him the first time. Not curiosity, just inventory. "Know and she'll be back?" "I don't." Voss's eyes moved to Clara, who had come out of the school and crossed the yard and stopped 10 feet from Pryor. She could feel the attention of the settlement behind her. Curtains, doorways, the specific quality of people watching without wanting to appear to watch. "Mrs. Whitmore," Voss said. He said it with a particular easiness that told her he'd asked someone who she was. "I heard you've been helping Mrs. Holloway with her paperwork." "I help where I can," Clara said. "That's admirable." He smiled the way he'd smiled at Margaret from horseback, the smile that was really just the face pleasantness makes when it's being used as a tool. "I wonder if you could help me understand something. There seems to be a disagreement about the eastern boundary of this property." "There's no disagreement," Clara said. "There's an accurate deed and a corrupted county record. Those are different things." Something shifted in Voss's expression. It was brief, just the adjustment a face makes when it receives information it wasn't expecting. And then it was gone, and the smile was back, but she'd seen it. He hadn't known about Prescott, or he hadn't known they'd been there. "Strong language," he said. "Accurate language," she said. "The original deed is on file with the Territorial Land Office in Prescott. The boundary is the creek. It's been the creek since 1877. If the county record says something different, someone changed it, and that's a matter for a territorial judge." The smile didn't waver, but his eyes did, just slightly, the way eyes do when a man is recalculating behind them. One of his riders shifted his horse, and Ed Pryor moved. And from the corner of her eye, Clara saw Miguel Garza appear at the edge of his property line, and then Tom Renner from the other direction. And she understood without any of them having said a word that they had arranged this beforehand, while she was in the school. The men of Pine Ridge had put themselves in the road with no discussion needed, because some things in a settlement that has survived on mutual reliance don't require discussion. Voss looked at the arrangement of people around him. He was still on horseback, still had his 4 riders, still had every apparent advantage of position. But something had changed in the architecture of the situation, and he was feeling it. "I'll be talking to my attorneys," he said. "That's your right," Clara said. "We'll be talking to Judge Henry Farwell in Tucson." She said it the way you put a card on the table, without drama. Just the name, placed where he could see it. This time, the shift in his expression was larger, and he didn't manage to cover it as fast. Farwell's name had landed, which meant Farwell's name meant something to him, which was probably not good news for Voss in ways she was only beginning to understand. He looked at her for a long moment. Then he turned his horse, the riders turned with him, and they rode back up the settlement road at a pace that was still unhurried, but was no longer the particular unhurried pace of a man who controls the situation. It was the pace of a man managing his exit. Pryor waited until they were well gone, and then let out a breath through his nose that was the closest thing to a visible emotion she'd seen from him. "Farwell," he said. "Margaret gave me the name before she left," Clara said. "Told me to use it if he came." "Did she say why that name?" "She said Voss had tried to get a land case in Farwell's court 2 years ago, and Farwell had thrown it out and told him in open court that his surveying methods were creative." She paused. Margaret's word. Creative. Pryor made a sound that was not quite a laugh, but was related to one. "All right," he said, and went back to his fence. It rained that night. Not the hard sideways desert rain of Clara's first wagon ride to Pine Ridge, but a slow, steady rain that came down straight and covered the settlement in the particular white sound of water on rooftops. Clara sat at the desk in the room that had become her room, with the lamp at low and the window cracked an inch because she liked the smell of rain on dry ground. She was writing a letter to Mrs. Fitch in Lawrence. She had written 2 since arriving in Pine Ridge and received 1 in return, forwarded through the Silver Creek Post. Mrs. Fitch's letter had said, in the particular way of Mrs. Fitch, who had opinions about most things and kept none of them to herself, that she hoped Clara had done better than she feared she would, and that Ethan was eating properly, and that the man better be worth it, which was a sentence that had made Clara fold the letter and put it away before she finished it. She was writing now about the school, about Ruth and James and Samuel Pryor spelling 17 words right at supper, about the roof that Wyatt had fixed and the shutter and the way the room was finally level enough to feel like a place where work could happen. She was writing around the things she was not yet ready to put in a letter, which was most of the things that actually occupied her. She put the pen down and looked at the rain on the window. She thought about Daniel, not the grief of him, that had changed shape over 2 years from something acute to something chronic, the difference between a break and a scar, but the specific Daniel of him, the way he approached a problem. The land dispute in Lawrence that he had solved by going to the primary source because he didn't trust secondary records and didn't trust people who told him that primary sources weren't necessary. She had sat at a different kitchen table in a different house and watched him teach himself how to read a survey document, and she had read along because there was nothing else to do, and she was constitutionally unable to sit in a room with an open book and not engage with it. She had not known, at that table in Lawrence, that she was learning something she would need. You never know, while you're learning a thing, what you're learning it for. Outside, the rain continued its steady work on Pine Ridge. She picked up the pen and finished the letter to Mrs. Fitch, and she said, "Because Mrs. Fitch would want to know, and because she'd earned the honesty of knowing, I think I'm going to be all right. I wasn't sure for a long time. I'm not certain now, but I think so." Margaret and Wyatt came back on the 8th day, 2 days later than expected, which had produced in Clara a calibrated worry that she had managed by teaching additional lessons and reorganizing the school's book supply and rewriting the arithmetic curriculum for the older students, and then doing it again when the first version didn't satisfy her. She heard the wagon from the school and came out, and she knew from the way Wyatt was sitting, the particular set of his shoulders, the absence of the road tightness that had been there when he left, before anyone said anything. Margaret climbed down from the wagon with the leather case still under her arm and looked at Clara across the yard with an expression that was exhausted and something else, something that had traveled 8 days in each direction to get there. "Farwell reviewed everything," Margaret said. She didn't say it as an announcement. She said it the way you say something you've been holding carefully for a week and are now very carefully setting down. The territorial registration copy, the amendment notation, Alcott's statement. He issued a finding that the county record amendment was filed without property owner notification or consent and constitutes fraudulent alteration of a public document. Clara looked at her. "It's not final," Margaret said. "Voss has 30 days to respond. His attorneys can challenge the finding. There are more steps. But Farwell issued an injunction stopping any action on the disputed land until the case is resolved, which means Voss can't file, can't fence, can't do anything legal with those 200 yards while the injunction stands." She paused. "And Farwell referred the alteration question to the Territorial Attorney General's office. Arthur Denny is going to be investigated." "That's more than we had," Clara said. "Considerably more." Margaret looked at the settlement around her, the houses, the school, the fence line visible at the east edge of Pryor's property. "He's not done. You should know that. Voss doesn't concede a thing he thinks he can still win. He'll find other angles." "He came while you were gone," Clara said. "I used Farwell's name." Wyatt, who had been unhitching the horse, stopped. "He didn't know we'd been to Prescott," Clara continued, "or he didn't know Farwell was involved. The name rattled him." Margaret looked at her for a moment. "What did he do?" "He left." A silence. Then Margaret said, "You held this place for 8 days." "I taught school," Clara said. "Pryor and Renner and Garza held the rest." "You held the rest," Margaret said, with the flat certainty of a woman who doesn't make statements she doesn't mean. "And they held it because you were here." Clara didn't argue with her. She had learned that some things were true enough to accept without qualification. Time. The legal process moved the way legal processes move in frontier territories, slowly, with long intervals of apparent inaction and then sudden bursts of activity that required everything at once. Voss's attorneys filed a response to Farwell's finding 26 days in. The response challenged the authority of the Prescott registration copy on technical grounds, which Farwell rejected in a written ruling that Margaret read aloud to Clara and Wyatt at the kitchen table with the contained satisfaction of a woman reading a document that confirmed she was right. But 2 weeks after Farwell's rejection of the technical challenge, Voss made a different move. He acquired the note on Tom Renner's property. Tom had borrowed against his land 3 years earlier to buy cattle that hadn't fully paid back. The note was held by a bank in Silver Creek, and the bank sold it, legally, without any obligation to notify Tom, to a land company that turned out to be Voss's, at one remove. The note was called in at 60 days. Tom Renner came to Clara on a Wednesday evening with his hat in his hands and a face that had done something complicated and resolved into stillness, which she understood as the stillness of a man holding himself together by will. 60 days, he said. I can't clear it in 60 days. Clara looked at him. How much? He told her. It was not a small number, and it was not an impossible number, and it was exactly calibrated to be just past what a man in Tom Renner's position could raise in 60 days on his own, which told her the calculation had been made deliberately. Sit down, she said. He sat. She went to find Margaret, and then Wyatt, and the four of them sat at the kitchen table and looked at the problem the way they'd looked at the documents, not with panic, which wouldn't help, but with the working attention of people who have limited time and need to use it correctly. He can't take Renner's land directly, Wyatt said. Farwell's injunction covers the eastern boundary dispute, but not unrelated properties. Renner's land isn't in the injunction, Margaret said. It's his own parcel, which shares a fence line with the settlement's north pasture, Clara said. The room was quiet for a moment. Everyone understood what she meant. If Voss owned Tom Renner's property, he didn't need the disputed east land anymore. He'd have the north approach instead. He's patient, Clara said. He's been doing this for 12 years. He can lose one case and find another angle. He doesn't need to win everything, he just needs to win eventually. Tom Renner was looking at the table. I'm not asking anyone to. You're not asking, Margaret said. We're deciding. Margaret, what's the number, Tom? He said it again. Margaret looked at Wyatt. Wyatt looked at Clara. Clara thought about $11 and a suitcase and a decision made on a depot platform in Silver Creek, and she thought about the particular arithmetic of people who have nothing left to lose, which is not the same arithmetic as people who have something and are afraid to spend it. I have savings, she said. The table looked at her. Not enough on its own, but something. Clara, Wyatt said. I have been paid every month since September, she said, with the quiet precision of someone making an argument. I have spent almost none of it because I have a room and meals and no need for much else. What I have is not the note, but combined, she looked at Margaret. Margaret was already calculating. I have operating reserve, earmarked for the cattle purchase in spring, but that can wait a season. Between us, Clara said. And me, Wyatt said. He said it simply, the way he said most things, without making a performance of it. I've been building reserve for 3 years. I wasn't planning to spend it yet. A pause. But the plan can change. Tom Renner looked at the three of them with an expression that moved through several things quickly and came out the other side as something raw and unmanaged that he didn't try to hide, which was itself a kind of trust. I'll pay every cent back, he said. We know, Clara said. That's not why we're doing it. She said it, and she meant it, and she understood while she said it that it was also true that 6 months ago she would not have had the settlement to do it for. 6 months ago, she had nothing but the next 12 hours. The accumulation of small days, lessons taught, roofs fixed, documents read, the patience of showing up and doing the work without needing it to be noticed, had built something that was only visible now that it was being asked to hold weight. The next morning, Wyatt rode to Silver Creek and paid the note out of a combination of 3 people's savings and his own at the bank counter, with Arthur Denny's replacement watching from across the room, because the county clerk's investigation had reached the point where Denny had been asked to step aside pending review, which was its own particular satisfaction. He came back with a receipt and put it on Margaret's table. Tom Renner, who had been sitting in Margaret's house since early morning because there was nowhere else he could stand to wait, looked at it for a moment. That's my land, he said. That's your land, Wyatt confirmed. Tom picked up the receipt and folded it carefully, the way you fold something you intend to keep for a long time, and put it in his breast pocket and said, "Thank you," in a voice that was completely even, which was the only way he could say it. Voss did not come again in person. He sent a letter through his attorneys that was addressed to Margaret and CC'd to Farwell's court, offering to settle the boundary dispute by accepting a modified line 30 yards east of Pine Creek rather than 200 and calling it a compromise. Margaret read it at the kitchen table with Clara beside her. "He's reducing his claim," Clara said. "He is. Not because he wants to, because Farwell's ruling and the Denny investigation together are making his original position harder to maintain." She read the letter again. "This is him finding a position he can defend if it goes further." "I know what it is," Margaret said. "What do you want to do?" Margaret folded the letter. "What I want," she said carefully, "is the creek. The original line. Not a modified line. Not a compromise. Not 30 yards east. The creek." She set the letter on the table. "What we tell Farwell is that we don't accept and that we'd like the original proceeding to continue." "He may push harder then." "He may." Margaret looked at the letter. "But he's been pushing for 12 years, and he picked the wrong settlement this time. I'd like him to understand that completely before we're done." Clara wrote the response to Farwell that afternoon. She wrote it carefully, in the formal register she'd learned from Daniel's documents, and had been refining through the months of this case, clear and specific, and without the hedging language that looked like uncertainty even when it wasn't. She stated their position, referenced the documentary evidence on file, and respectfully declined the proposed modification. She read it back to Margaret, who listened with her eyes closed and then said, "Send it." Wyatt found her at the school 2 evenings later. She was alone. Ethan was at the Renner house, where he had apparently been adopted by the Renner children in the way children adopt each other when given proximity and time. She was working on next month's lessons, which had grown considerably more ambitious than September's had been, because the children had grown considerably more capable. He came to the door and she looked up. "Farwell issued his preliminary ruling," he said. She set down the pen. "Pine Creek East Bank," he said. "As described in the 1877 deed. The county record amendment is voided. Denny's been formally referred to the Attorney General, and Farwell added a note to his ruling." He stopped, something working in his face. He said the documentation in this case was among the clearest he'd seen in a territorial land dispute. He said it specifically. The documentation. Clara looked at him for a moment. She thought about Daniel at the kitchen table. She thought about a depot platform in September with 47 people watching. She thought about $11 and a cracked shutter and a room over Margaret's house that had become, without her entirely deciding it had, the first place in 3 years that felt like a place she was in rather than a place she was passing through. "It's preliminary," she said. "It is," Wyatt agreed. "Voss has more moves." "I know. But this one was ours." She looked at him. He was standing in the doorway of the school he had fixed with his own hands, in the light that came through the window he had reattached the shutter to, in the settlement where he had spent 3 years proving to himself and anyone watching that the man he'd become was worth something. He wasn't smiling, exactly, but there was something in him that she recognized, the specific quality of a person who has done a hard thing and feels the solidity of it. She said, "Sit down, Wyatt." He came in and sat on the bench across the table from her. Outside, Pine Ridge was doing what it always did in the early evening, settling, quieting, the smoke from dinner fires, the particular sounds of a settlement ending its day. "I want to ask you something," she said, "and I want you to answer it honestly and not carefully." He looked at her. "All right. When you came to Silver Creek to find me, you said you volunteered to go instead of whoever Margaret had sent." "That's right." "You'd heard about what happened at the station." "I had." "Why did you want to go yourself? Not the answer about trust you gave me then. The real one." He was quiet for a moment. Not because he was deciding whether to answer, she thought, because he was deciding how exactly to say it accurately. Because the story of a woman standing on a platform with a 6-year-old and nowhere to go, and a room full of people watching her be turned away. That story. He stopped, started again. "I know what it is to be the person in the story that people are watching and deciding about. I didn't want that to be the last thing that happened to you in Silver Creek. I thought if someone came who understood what that felt like, it might make the offer easier to trust." Clara looked at the table, then at him. "It did," she said. He nodded once, the way he nodded when something was settled, I'm not the same person who got off that train, she said. I want you to know that I'm aware of that. I came here with nothing, and I have been, she measured the words, I have been received here. By Margaret, by this settlement, by you. I know what that is. I'm not going to pretend I came here with anything that entitled me to it. Nobody comes here with something that entitles them to it, he said. That's the whole point of it. She looked at him for a long moment. What do you want, Wyatt? Not for the settlement, for yourself. He looked back at her with the honest directness of a man who has practiced saying difficult true things because he spent years saying easy false ones. I want what I'm building, he said. The ranch, the life here. I want to keep doing the work. He paused. I want Ethan to have the room he needs to grow up in without someone deciding in advance what he's allowed to become. Another pause, shorter. And I want you to be here when I come in from the east pasture in the evening. The school was very quiet. Outside, a child's voice, Ruth Renner's, she thought, called something across the settlement road. Clara said, I'm not easy to be around. I haven't found that. You haven't known me long enough. I've known you through a land fraud case and a debt payoff and 6 weeks of watching you do the hardest version of every job you were given, he said. I think I have a reasonable picture. She looked at him. She thought about the word careful and what it had cost her and what it had saved her and whether those were the same thing or very different things depending on the situation. Ask me again in the spring, she said. He looked at her, and she could see him deciding whether that was a yes said carefully or a no said kindly, and she watched him settle on the accurate reading of it, which she appreciated. Spring, he said. Spring, she confirmed. He stood, put his hat on, and went to the door. He stopped there for a moment without turning around. Clara. Wyatt? For what it's worth, he said. I already know what I'm going to ask. He went out. She listened to his footsteps cross the yard and fade toward the east, toward the small house he had built with his own hands in the 3 years he'd been turning himself into someone worth knowing. She sat at the school desk in the quiet for a long time. Outside, Pine Ridge completed its evening with the unhurried competence of a place that had survived things and intended to keep surviving them. The Renner house had its light on. The Garza house. Pryor's fence line was a dark shape at the eastern edge, exactly where it had always been, exactly where it was going to stay. She picked up the pen and went back to next month's lessons. Voss's final move came in February, and it came not through lawyers or land offices, but through the most ordinary and devastating tool available to a man with money in a territory that didn't have enough of it. He bought the Silver Creek Courier, not directly. Through the same land company structure he'd used for Tom Renner's note, at one remove, so that when the name on the masthead changed, it changed to a man named Elias Pruitt, who had no visible connection to Voss Range, and who arrived in Silver Creek in January presenting himself as a publisher with Eastern backing looking to expand into the territories. Nobody connected it immediately. Margaret connected it in the 3rd week of February when the Courier ran its first story about Pine Ridge. The story called the settlement a haven for transients and persons of dubious history. It did not name Wyatt directly, but it described a man with a criminal past who had become an influential figure in the community, and there were not many men in Pine Ridge that description could fit. It mentioned a widow from Kansas who had arrived under circumstances the writer described as irregular and suggested the settlement's resistance to the legitimate land claims of neighboring ranchers was being orchestrated by outside interests. The word outsiders appeared 4 times in the piece. Margaret brought the paper to the kitchen table and read it aloud to Clara and Wyatt without expression, which was how she read things she was angry about. When she finished, she folded it and put it down. Wyatt was looking at the window. His jaw was set in the way it set when he was holding something in that he didn't intend to let out where it would do damage. It's not wrong about my past, he said. It's wrong about everything else, Clara said. People don't always separate those things. Some people don't, she said. The people here do. He looked at her. The people here aren't the only people who read the Courier. That was the calculation, and they all knew it. Farwell's ruling was preliminary. The Attorney General's investigation of Arthur Denny was ongoing. Neither was yet final. And in the interval between what had been decided and what had been concluded, public opinion in the county seat was a variable that mattered. A judge in a territorial court operated in a context. He was not immune to what the county believed about a case, particularly a land case involving a small settlement with no political weight against a man who had been in the territory for 12 years and employed 40 people. "How many people read the Courier?" Clara said. "Silver Creek, the surrounding ranches, a few of the smaller settlements," Margaret said. "Maybe 300 households. And who knows us?" "Actually knows Pine Ridge, not the story Pruitt printed." Margaret thought, "The families who've dealt with us. The general merchant, Alderman Cooper, his wife's niece married Tom Renner's cousin. The school teacher in Silver Creek, Horace Mann, he and I have corresponded about the children for 2 years. "Then we write back," Clara said. They looked at her. "Not to the Courier," she said. "We write to every person in this county who has ever done business with this settlement, received a letter from Margaret, bought cattle from one of our families, or sent a child here for learning. We write to them personally, by name. We don't answer the Courier's story. We don't repeat it or defend against it. We just write the true account of what Pine Ridge is and what the land case is and what the documents show." She looked at Margaret. "You have 12 years of correspondence." "I have 12 years of correspondence," Margaret confirmed. "Then we have an audience that already knows your handwriting." The silence in the kitchen was the specific silence of people seeing the shape of a thing. "That's a great deal of writing," Wyatt said. "Yes," Clara said. "It is." She had spent the better part of her adult life in the particular labor of written communication, lesson plans, letters home to parents, the long correspondence with Daniel's family after he died, 6 months of letters to Gerald Hurst that she had composed carefully and that had mattered not at all in the end. She knew how to write for a reader. She knew how to find the sentence that made someone feel they were being told the truth rather than being sold something, which was the difference between a letter that got read and a letter that got set aside. They started that evening. Margaret pulled 12 years of correspondence files organized by year and by family, and Clara sat at the kitchen table and read through the names and the history of each relationship, who had helped with the cattle purchase of 1880, who had sent medicine during the fever that had gone through the settlement in 1881, who had loaned Margaret a piece of equipment and been paid back with interest in potatoes and labor. Every connection was a name. Every name was a person who had a prior relationship with Pine Ridge that Pruitt's story could not erase if they were reminded of it directly. Wyatt wrote too, which surprised her until she read what he wrote, and then it didn't. He wrote to the men he knew, the cattle buyers, the farriers, the men he'd worked alongside before Pine Ridge when he was still becoming the person he was trying to become. He wrote without apology and without elaborate explanation. He said, "You know me. You know what I was. This is what I've built, and this is what someone is trying to take from it. I'm asking you to know the difference between the story in the paper and the man you worked with." It was not elegant. It was not the language of someone who had practiced persuasion. It was exactly the language of a man who had learned that honesty, said plainly, lands differently than eloquence. By the end of the first week, they had sent 43 letters. By the end of the second, 61. Ed Pryor came to the school on a Thursday in the third week of February, which was unusual. Pryor generally found reasons to be wherever Clara wasn't, not from hostility, but from the specific social economy of a man who spends what he has carefully and who had already spent something significant in the conversation about his east fence line. He came to the school and he stood in the doorway with his hat in his hands, and she told James to keep the younger ones on their sums and stepped outside. "I have a cousin in Silver Creek," Pryor said. "Works the land office, not Denny's office, the adjudication side." "All right," Claire said. "He says there's talk." Pryor turned his hat in his hands once. "The Courier piece, people read it, and they asked around, and—" He paused, working out the way to say something that was complicated in a form that would come out straight. "Some people believed it. Some people who knew Margaret didn't, and some people who didn't know Margaret wrote to her." "Wrote to her?" "In response to her letters. Or Wyatt's. My cousin says there were 3 people in Silver Creek proper who went to the land office in the last week and asked to see the court filings in the Holloway case. On their own. Because they'd received letters and they wanted to verify. Clara looked at him. Farwell's preliminary ruling is a public document, Pryor said. Anyone who goes to the court office can read it. And if 3 people go, they tell 3 people. That's how Silver Creek works. She understood what he was telling her. The letters had done something she hadn't been able to calculate when they wrote them. They had sent people to the primary source. The same instinct Daniel had followed to Prescott, the same instinct that had unraveled Voss's alteration, was operating now in the other direction. People who wanted to know the truth of a thing and had been pointed toward where the truth was kept. "Your cousin," she said. "Is he willing to say what he saw? Officially?" Pryor's expression shifted. "I wasn't asking that." "I know you weren't. I'm asking now." He was quiet for a moment. "I'll talk to him." He left. She went back inside where James had managed the younger children with the quiet authority of a 14-year-old who has been trusted with something and intends to justify it. And she looked at her class, Ruth with her book open, Samuel working his sums with the focused aggression he brought to arithmetic, Bess reading aloud under her breath in the way she'd developed of reinforcing the words through sound. And she thought about 43 letters becoming 61 and 3 people in Silver Creek walking into a courthouse on their own. You couldn't control what people did with the truth. You could only put it where they could find it and trust that enough of them would look. Farwell's final ruling came on the 14th of March. It came by courier to Margaret's house at mid-morning, and Margaret opened it at the kitchen table with Clara beside her and Wyatt standing at the window in the same position he'd stood in when Voss first came, which she had come to understand was where he went when he needed to be still. She read it herself first. Then she read it aloud. The ruling confirmed and finalized the preliminary finding. The 1883 amendment to the county survey record was declared fraudulent, void, and struck from the record. The boundary of Pine Ridge land was confirmed as Pine Creek East Bank, as recorded in the original 1877 deed. Voss's claim to the disputed 200 yards was denied in full. The ruling further noted that the pattern of conduct documented in the case, the amendment, the lack of notification, the relationship between the county clerk and the opposing party, had been forwarded to the territorial attorney general with a recommendation for criminal investigation. In a final paragraph that was not standard in land rulings, Farwell wrote that the quality of documentation presented by the property holder was exceptional and reflected a serious and thorough approach to the preservation of legal record, and that the court wished to note this for the record. Margaret stopped reading there. The kitchen was very quiet. Wyatt said from the window, "That's it." "That's it," Margaret said. Clara looked at the ruling on the table in front of her. She looked at the boundary line written in Farwell's formal hand, Pine Creek East Bank. And she thought about those same words in a document from 1877, sealed in a territorial office, waiting for someone to go to Prescott and ask. She thought about how close it had been. Not close in the legal sense, the documents had always been clear, but close in the human sense. If she hadn't known about primary records, if Wyatt hadn't gone, if Margaret had accepted Voss's compromise out of exhaustion or practicality or the weight of fighting for too long alone, every step had been necessary. None of them had been inevitable. "He'll appeal," she said. Not pessimism, just accuracy. "He can try," Margaret said. "He'll appeal to a territorial court with a fraudulent alteration finding in the record, a criminal referral to the Attorney General, and 61 letters from county residents in the file that Farwell accepted as character testimony." She looked at Clara. "I filed those with the court. After Farwell's preliminary ruling, I asked if community correspondence could be entered as supporting record, and he said it could." A pause. "You didn't know that?" "I didn't. I should have told you. I wanted to see what happened first." Margaret folded the ruling carefully and placed it in the leather case that had made the trip to Tucson and back, and had been sitting on the kitchen shelf since then, used now as a kind of archive. "What happened was that he read them. All 61. He mentioned them in a note to my attorney. He said—" She stopped, something moving in her face. "He said a settlement with that many people willing to put their name to paper on its behalf is a settlement that deserves to stand." Clara pressed her hands flat on the table. Outside she could hear the school, the sound of children, Ruth's voice, higher than the others, and Samuel's particular laugh, which he produced rarely and at full volume when he produced it at all. Somewhere Ethan was in that sound, the specific thread of him that she could pick out of any crowd. Now the way you can always pick out the thing you've been listening for longest. She had not cried since Daniel's funeral. She had come close twice in Pine Ridge, both times in the first weeks. Both times she'd managed it. She managed it now. But it was a different kind of managing. Not suppression, just the deliberate choice of a woman who has things still to do and intends to do them. "What do we tell the settlement?" Wyatt said. "The truth," Clara said. "The same thing we always tell them." They gathered that evening in Margaret's house. All 8 families, which meant the kitchen and the front room, and people standing in the doorway, and Ethan sitting on the floor beside Ruth Renner because there were no chairs left at their height. Margaret told them what Farwell's ruling said, in plain language, without theater. She told them what it meant and what it didn't mean, and what would likely happen next with the Attorney General's investigation, which could take months or could go nowhere, because that was also possible and they deserved to know it. Tom Renner asked about his note. Wyatt told him the note was cleared and his land was his and had always been his. Tom nodded in the same way he'd nodded at the receipt, once with the whole weight of him behind it. Miguel Garza said, in the careful English he used in formal settings, that he wanted it noted that the community had done this together, and that no one person should take credit for what everyone had built. He said it looking at Clara, which was a very specific kind of credit disguised as the opposite. Ed Pryor said nothing at all, which was how Ed Pryor said a great deal. James Garza, who was technically there as a family member and not as a student, but who sat at the back of the room listening to everything with the attention of someone who intends to understand the whole of something rather than the piece of it he was assigned, raised his hand. Margaret acknowledged him. "The school in Tucson," he said. "The advanced program. My mother wrote to them in January." The room looked at him. "They wrote back," he said. He was doing the thing he did when he was controlling something, the careful containment, the door open just a crack. "They have a place, starting in September." Rosaria Garza made a sound that was not a word. "If I can prepare the entrance work," James said, looking at Clara, "between now and August." "Then we have 5 months," Clara said. "That's enough." He nodded, the door opening a little wider. He was 14 years old, and he was going to Tucson in September, and he had come to Pine Ridge not being able to do long division, and all of that was true at the same time, and the weight of it sat in that room, and everyone felt it, and nobody said the big words for it because the big words would have been too small. Spring came to Pine Ridge the way spring came to the high desert, grudgingly, incrementally, as though the land wasn't sure it had agreed to the arrangement. March was cold mornings and warm afternoons. April was the beginning of something, the particular green that appeared in the scrub brush when the winter water finally reached it, so different from the summer brown that it looked like an error. Wyatt started the foundation of the addition to his house in early April. He'd been planning it since February, and Clara had known he was planning it because he'd asked her twice. In the careful sideways way he asked things he cared about, what she thought about a south-facing window in a kitchen. Both times she had told him south-facing was the right choice. Both times he had nodded and moved on without pressing it, which was how he respected the timeline she'd given him. On a Saturday in the middle of April, she walked to his property without particular announcement and stood at the edge of the foundation work and looked at what he'd done. The footings were laid. The frame of the addition was begun, just the upright posts yet, but spaced in a way that showed the plan clearly. A room that faced south, a room with windows on 2 sides, a room that was large enough for more than one person to work in comfortably. He was there. He looked up and then kept working, which she appreciated. "South-facing," she said. "South-facing," he confirmed. He set a board and measured it before he spoke again. "You said spring." "I did." He set the measuring line down and looked at her. He didn't ask the question again. He'd said he already knew what he'd ask, and she believed him, and this was the spring. The question was already in the air between them, and they both knew it, and neither of them needed the words for the thing to be real. "Yes?" she said. He looked at her for a moment, then he picked up the measuring line again. "The window will be in by June," he said. "I'll want curtains," she said. "I figured." She stayed for another hour, not working exactly, but present in the way you are present when something is being built that you intend to inhabit. She held boards when he needed boards held. She asked questions when she had them, and he answered without explaining more than was asked, which was a quality she had come to value specifically in a world full of men who felt that answering a woman's practical question required extensive preamble about why the question made sense. When she left, she walked back across the yard in the April light and thought about a train platform in September and a man she had agreed to marry based on letters, and a calculation about practical necessity, and the way that door had closed in front of 47 witnesses. She had thought, standing on that platform, that she was at the end of something. She had been wrong in the precise way that the worst moments usually involve, not because the thing that happened wasn't terrible, but because it was also, in ways she couldn't have seen from inside it, a door. She did not believe that suffering was designed to teach lessons. She did not believe that the bad things arranged themselves into a plan. What she believed, what she had come to believe in 9 months of Pine Ridge, through land cases and cracked slates and 61 letters and a boy spelling 17 words right at supper, was that people are more various than their worst moments, and that the thing you become after something breaks you is not predetermined. You get to decide that part. You decide it not in one moment of resolution, but in the daily accumulation of showing up and doing the work and treating the people around you as people. That was not a comfortable belief. It did not promise that things would work out. It just said that you had more agency than despair wanted you to think, and that the work was worth doing even when the outcome was uncertain, and that a room with a south-facing window was worth wanting even when you didn't yet know if you'd be in it. She thought Daniel would have liked Wyatt. Not for sentimental reasons. Daniel had been a practical man, and he would have liked Wyatt for practical reasons. Because Wyatt measured twice. Because he fixed what was broken without making a production of it. Because when something went wrong, he stayed in the room. She thought about him, and she missed him with the particular miss of someone who has been missing a person long enough that it has become a weather condition rather than an emergency. Present, sometimes acute, but no longer the only thing in the sky. Ethan's 7th birthday was in May. He had been 6 when he held her hand on the depot platform in Silver Creek and asked where they were going now. And he was 7 now, and he knew where he was going, which was school in the morning and the Renner children in the afternoon, and Wyatt's property on Saturdays to hold boards, and ask questions at a rate that should have exhausted a grown man, and apparently did not. Clara made him a cake with the eggs Helen Renner had brought over and the sugar that had come in on the last supply run, and she made it imperfectly in the way of a woman who is a good teacher and a competent cook and an indifferent baker. The cake listed to one side, and the sweetness was uneven. Ethan looked at it with the serious, evaluative expression he'd inherited from his father and said, "It leans." "I know it leans," Clara said. "It still looks good." "It leans and it's still good," she said. "That's the most honest description of most things." He looked at her with the directness he'd always had, that quality of attending fully to whatever was in front of him. "Are we staying?" he said. "Here, in Pine Ridge." "Yes," she said. "We're staying." He nodded in the way she recognized, the way he nodded when something he'd been holding in uncertain balance became settled weight. He had been carrying the uncertainty of it for 9 months without complaint, and without, she realized, ever quite asking until now. He had watched her and trusted her the way he had always watched and trusted her, the way a child trusts when the adult in charge has earned it not by promising that things will be fine, but by doing the next thing and the thing after that until fine became a reasonable description of the situation. "Good," he said. "I want to learn to build things. Wyatt said he'd teach me." "I know he did. Is that all right?" She looked at her son, 7 years old, gap-toothed, wearing a shirt that was already too short in the arms because he was growing faster than she could sew, sitting in the kitchen of a house in a settlement she had arrived at with $11 and nothing else in September, and which was, in the most uncomplicated sense of the word, home. "That's all right," she said. He picked up his fork and ate his birthday cake with the focused pleasure of a child who has decided that a thing leaning doesn't change what it tastes like. The Attorney General's investigation of Arthur Denny concluded in June. Denny resigned his position before the formal findings were issued, which was the move of a man who understood that resigning allowed him more negotiating room than being removed it. The findings were issued anyway, a formal censure, a prohibition from public office for 10 years, and a civil referral to the territorial court for damages payable to the property owners whose records had been affected. Margaret received a letter about the civil referral in July. The amount involved was not large, but was not nothing, and she folded the letter and put it with the other documents in the leather case and said, "I'll use it for the school." Clara looked at her. "Books," Margaret said, "real ones. Not the dozen we have that have been read to pieces. James goes to Tucson in 2 months. Ruth will be ready for advanced reading by winter. The younger ones are going to need—" She stopped. "I'll use it for books." "Some of it," Clara said. "You should keep some of it." "I have what I need." "Margaret." "I have what I need," the older woman said again, more quietly. "I've had what I need since 1877. I just needed enough people to help me keep it." She said it simply and without sentiment and went back to her correspondence, which was thicker than it had ever been because 61 letters had generated responses, and those responses had generated a network of people who now considered themselves in relationship with Pine Ridge. And a relationship with Pine Ridge was, as it turned out, a relationship worth maintaining. Tated. James Garza left for Tucson on a Thursday in late August. His mother had pressed his good shirt 3 times the night before. His father shook his hand at the wagon with both of his, the grip of a man giving something rather than just touching something. His younger siblings watched from the porch with the collective expression of children who don't fully understand the scale of what they're witnessing, but know it's large. Clara stood at the edge of the yard. She had given James his last set of preparation work 2 weeks before, harder than anything she'd assigned all year, hard enough that he'd come in early twice to check his work and still hadn't been certain. He'd completed all of it correctly. She'd told him so without embellishment, and he'd received it the same way. Not modestly, not with performance, just with the simple acknowledgement of a person who knows the truth of a thing and doesn't need decoration around it. At the wagon, he looked at her. He wasn't good at the large, expressive gestures, and she'd always liked that about him. What he said was, "The younger ones are going to need someone to set harder problems." "I'll manage," she said. "I know you will." He climbed into the wagon. "I'm going to read everything they have in Tucson." "I know you will," she said back. The wagon moved down the settlement road, and she watched it go with the specific feeling of watching something you built become something that doesn't need you anymore, which is exactly what you were building it to be. She and Wyatt married in September, 1 year to the month from the train platform in Silver Creek. It was not an elaborate ceremony. Margaret witnessed it, and the settlement attended, and Ethan stood beside Wyatt with the solemnity of a 7-year-old who has been given a formal role and intends to execute it with appropriate gravity. Ruth Renner cried, which surprised everyone, including Ruth. Ed Pryor shook Wyatt's hand with the same 2-handed grip Miguel Garza had given his son, which Clara understood meant a great deal coming from Pryor, and which Wyatt understood the same way. Clara wore her second dress, the one she'd folded over the chair in the boarding house in Silver Creek on the night she'd tried to make arithmetic work. It was not a wedding dress. It was a good dress. Clean, pressed, hers. She had not brought much to Pine Ridge. She had brought herself and her son, and the knowledge that a person can survive the thing that looks unsurvivable, and that surviving it is not the end of the story. Afterward, in the house that was now theirs, the south-facing window in place, the curtains she'd made from cloth. Helen Renner had helped her choose the room that fit more than one person working in it comfortably. She sat at the kitchen table while Ethan slept upstairs and Wyatt built up the fire against the September chill. She thought about the version of herself who had written letters to a stranger for 6 months and believed them enough to spend her last money on a train ticket. She did not have contempt for that woman. That woman had been doing the best she could with the information she had and the options available to her, which is all anyone does. And the people who talk about others' choices as though more wisdom was available at the time than actually was have usually never been in a situation where the options were all insufficient. She had made the wrong choice, and it had led her to the right place. And she didn't know what to do with that, except to acknowledge it as the complicated true thing it was. Not a lesson, not a plan, just the way a particular life had moved through time, shaped by what she did and what others did, and what happened that nobody chose. Wyatt sat across from her. The fire was going. Outside the window, Pine Ridge was dark and quiet in the way of a settlement that has worked hard and earned its rest. "What are you thinking about?" he said. "Silver Creek," she said. He looked at her. "Not with regret," she said. "I'm thinking about the platform. I'm thinking about how certain I was that everything had just ended." She looked at the fire. "I was so sure. The way you're sure of something when you're in the middle of it and you can't see any of the edges. What do you see now?" She considered this honestly, the way she tried to consider most things. "I see that I had more to do," she said. "I just didn't know yet what it was." He didn't say that everything happened for a reason, because he was not a man who said things he didn't believe, and he didn't believe that. He didn't say it had all worked out, because there were things that hadn't worked out. Daniel was still gone. The land fight had cost money they'd needed. Denny's resignation was its own small injustice wrapped inside the larger justice. Life did not clean up its edges. What he said was, "I'm glad you stayed." "I stayed because I had nowhere else to go," she said. "Then I stayed because I had somewhere to be." "Is there a difference?" "All the difference," she said. She looked at the man across the table from her. This person who had been the worst version of himself and had spent 4 years becoming someone else. Not through any single redemptive act, but through the same daily accumulation that she had used herself. The relentless, ordinary work of showing up and being useful and treating people as they deserved to be treated. He was not a simple man and she was not a simple woman, and what they had built was not simple, and none of that was a problem. It was just the actual texture of an actual life, which is always more complicated and more livable than it looks from the outside. Upstairs, Ethan made a sound in his sleep and was quiet again. She thought about Ruth Renner reading her first full sentence. She thought about Samuel spelling 17 words right at supper. She thought about James Garza in Tucson with every book the school had, setting himself against problems she hadn't been able to give him. She thought about 61 letters and the 3 people who had walked into a courthouse and asked to see the documents because someone had pointed them toward the truth and they'd had the instinct to look. None of it had been guaranteed. She had not arrived in Pine Ridge knowing how it would go. She had arrived in the rain with a suitcase and a 6-year-old and the residue of a humiliation so public it had become a story people told in Silver Creek for months afterward. The woman Hearst turned down at the station. She had arrived and she had done the next thing, and then the thing after that. And she had not been perfect at any of it, and she had not needed to be. That was the thing she wanted people to know. Not that it worked out. It had worked out for her, and would not work out the same way for everyone, because the world was not arranged by merit. And the people who arrived at good places did not always arrive there because they deserved it more than the people who didn't. But that the work was worth doing regardless. That you could arrive somewhere in the rain with nothing and still build something, not because you were exceptional, but because you kept moving and you paid attention and you did not let the worst moment be the last word on who you were or what was possible. The fire settled. The house was warm. "Come to bed," Wyatt said. "In a minute," she said. He went. She sat alone in the kitchen of the house they'd built in the settlement she'd arrived at with $11 in September. And she listened to Pine Ridge at rest around her, the particular silence of a place that knows it has survived another day and intends to survive the next one. And she stayed there just a minute longer, the way you stay in a moment you want to remember completely. Then she turned down the lamp and went upstairs to her life.
I don't think I read anything wrong. Oh, sure, 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 sure. No, I didn't get you what you were saying wrong. No, 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 not at all. Not at all, dude. I'm simply just a person, and I know you were coming from a good place, by the way. All I'm saying is that if I ask for advice, I'll let you know. That's all. I'll be sure to I will certainly ask for it. Um, but if it's like general, like general giving just general advice to chat, I totally understand that too. But sometimes it can be, you know, TLDR used to do 10 push-ups until the ice cream truck stopped. Wow, dude. But I come from a family that gives advice without being solicited. So for me, it's like I've grown up with both, like, you know, both types, you know what I mean? So I'm kind of in the middle. I'm kind of indifferent to some extent, but I like sometimes I have this thing where it's like I don't want you know what I mean? I think I'll get what I'm saying.